What's up, everyone? So today we're going to dive into the most requested topic that I honestly get. And I think this is because I'm known as a property manager in a lot of places. Like, yes, I'm a real estate investor, but for some reason, the tag of me being a property manager is what seems to get a lot of traction right now. And I get so many questions from people across the country about how to hire a property manager. What questions should you be asking? Where do you find them? What things should you be discussing ahead of time? So I thought that'd be a great thing to dive into and just sort of give you a base foundation of how you should be hiring and evaluating a property manager. Now, I will make a full disclosure. As I said before, I'm a property manager, but this is not a self-serving podcast at all. In fact, you won't even hear the name of my company in this particular episode. So if you really want to find out, you'll have to search for it because this is not going to be self-servicing at all. Welcome to the Passive Income Revolution podcast, where we help you create the life that you dream of. Whether it's through real estate, entrepreneurship, or just savvy investing, we're here to help you make that dream life a reality. No matter if it's that yacht in the ocean or just a little extra time with your kids, we're here to help you. In last week's episode, we did a question about when is the proper time to hire a property manager. And in there, I said it all varies drastically based on your life, your goals, and a lot of other factors. And that's honestly true. Like, I could spend an entire episode dedicated to trying to figure out when you should hire a property manager. But we're going to kind of move on beyond that. Let's say you've already made that decision that, hey, I need a property manager. First thing is, where are you going to find them? Now, of course, it's really simple to do Google search. Google searches are great for many things today. Are they great for finding a property manager? Sure. For getting companies, names, things like that. But you always want to be doing some additional research. I prefer, before I look for any contractor, whether it be, a plumber, HVAC, general contractor, I always go to the local Facebook forums for real estate professionals first. So whatever groups I'm part of that might cover that area of the state, I'm going there and I'm asking for referrals first before I even do a Google search. I only do a Google search really if nothing comes up on these Facebook groups. So that's why I always sort of advocate investors being part of Facebook groups, little local communities where you can get referrals for various vendors that you need. And a property manager would be no different in this situation. So that would be a place that I would definitely consider first starting to find one, is just going to your local community of investors and seeing who they've used that's worked, or maybe even just finding out some of the horror stories of the ones you should stay away from. So even if you're not getting referrals about who to use, for sure, getting answers about who not to use and some of the issues that they've had in the past is just as useful. So now let's say you've got a couple property managers that you want to call. The first thing I've noticed when we get prospective owners calling into our office is that they always seem rather nervous, unsure what to talk about. And I know it's kind of an intimidating setting, but for me, what matters to me is that these people are trusting us with basically their retirement plan, their financial future. And that's why I always want to try and get them in the driver's seat. I want to get them popping off with their questions as soon as possible. So before you call property managers, just take a moment to consider what's important to you in the scheme of how your property is run. Obviously you're going to find out about fees. You want to ask about fees. You want to ask about the management, sort of the commission, then what the rates are charged for maintenance. You've got all these questions about that. But also take a moment to think about what is really important to you when it comes to your property and how it's operated. If you are someone who truly believes that if a tenant needs someone to come pick up their rent, and that's something that you believe should be continued, then you're going to want to express that to the property manager during the interview. So any sort of expectations you have on how the operation of your property should be managed, should definitely be something that should be discussed up front with the property manager. If you've got particulars like that, I encourage you to bring them up the sooner in the interview process. And that's what basically this is. This is an interview. You should view this as you're interviewing somebody for a job, because we are. As your property manager, you are hiring us to manage your property. Therefore, you should really be running this sort of like a job interview. And you always want to put your deal breakers towards the front of any interview, because that way you're not wasting time. If you find out that they won't do this thing or that thing that's really important to you, don't waste anybody's time. Then move on and end the conversation. So when you're interviewing property managers, make sure you know your deal breakers ahead of time. Get those out of the way before you get to the conversations about fees or other things. Anything that you want done a particular way, discuss that in the very beginning of the conversation. Now, what I will say about having things done in your particular way, I don't want to give you the impression that a property manager should or will bend over backwards to change their procedures to accommodate what you want. Most property management companies develop their procedures to be efficient, not just efficient for their own sake, but efficient for all of their owners' sakes. A great example of this is, let's say maybe you want rent picked up, and it's your preference that your tenants have that option. Well, as a property management company, I have to offer that then to all of my clients. If I'm suddenly have to go around and have my staff pick up rent from everybody's tenants, you can only imagine the huge sort of constraint that's going to place on our operations, and it's going to be a huge bottleneck, which means that eventually other things are going to be slowed down. We're not going to react as quickly, and it's going to be a snowball effect. So when I talk about expectations and making sure they're going to manage your property the way you'd like it to be operated, it's got to be in a very general sense, because we as companies have policies and procedures that make it the most effective for us across the board so that all of our clients can have great service. And that's an important thing to understand, is that a property manager is not going to manage the property exactly like you would. Because if you had to drop everything to go pick up rent for one of your 4 tenants, to you, it's not really a big deal. You've only got 4 tenants, maybe, not a huge deal. For a property management company who may have 225 tenants, if we're suddenly going around and doing that for a fair amount of the tenants, it becomes a huge constraint on our time. Now, that being said, there are some things that you should have control over. Some of my best examples of this is whether or not you accept pets, whether or not you accept smokers. Generally speaking, most property managers will advise you to accept smokers just because it really shrinks the tenant pool fairly considerably. But having the idea of whether or not you accept pets, smokers, those sorts of things should definitely be up to you. What should also be up to you, obviously, is lease terms, so length of lease terms. If you are a landlord who prefers 6-month leases, then honestly, your property manager should be willing to do 6-month leases as well. But we're always going to try and operate across the board as things that make us the most efficient for your sake and other owners. So we've talked about your expectations. Now we need to know what kind of questions you should be asking. So you want to hit the big hitters. The big hitters are, of course, the fees. So we talked about commission. We talked about maintenance. What does maintenance charge out at? Is there a base maintenance charge? If you call it a plumber to a property, 9 times out of 10, there's going to be a base charge. So ask the property management company, is there a base charge? What other sort of charges come into maintenance? Then we're going to get to the big one, which is commission. Now, commission, in its very strict sense, is just based on the collection of rent. But there's usually going to be additional fees that a property manager has. Some of the very common ones. So the first most common one is going to be a leasing fee. This is the fee for the time and effort it takes to place a brand new tenant. There's a lot of work that goes into a brand new tenant, whether it be just the hundreds of showings that may have occurred to fill a vacancy, to processing the application, calling employment references, calling past landlords, entering people in the system, getting them set up. There's a lot of things that goes in that really goes into that. So most places are going to charge you a leasing fee. It may be called something else, but it's basically the fee you pay for a brand new tenant being placed in a unit. This is going to vary anywhere from a couple hundred to a full month's rent. The other fee you might see is going to be what's called a lease renewal fee. This is one I'm not a fan of. This is one that is charged basically to send out a piece of paper, even, well, digitally nowadays, and ask the tenant if they want to stay longer or not and sign a lease. Yes, this is a thing that does get charged out by some property managers. I've seen it be anywhere from $50 to $100. And again, that's anytime they send out a lease renewal. It doesn't matter if the tenant renews it or not, you're likely being charged that fee. Another common fee is what I would call an invoice upcharge. So an invoice upcharge is, I hate to call it a practice, but I guess you would call it a practice. It's a practice that occurs in property management where some companies will take your plumber bill. We've talked about plumbing a lot in this one, so we'll pick on the plumbers, I guess. We'll not pick on the plumbers, but you have a plumber come out to your property. The property management company gets the bill. What some companies do is they charge an upcharge. So they enter that bill in the system, and their system auto-calculates an upcharge to be placed on your next monthly payment cycle. So sometimes it's 10%, sometimes it's 5%. Whatever the total bill is, they're going to add 10% or 5%. So in the instance of, let's say, for the sake of math, let's say you have a $90 plumbing bill. That would be nice, wouldn't it, if your plumbing bill was only $90, really? But if we have a upcharge on that, and let's say it's 10%, it's actually going to be $99. So $90 of that is going to go to the plumber, and $9 of that is going to go to the property manager. I'm not a fan of this upcharging of invoices because I think it's an incredibly awful way for a property management company to basically Scrooge McDuck themselves and amass a lot of money. Because if they're doing that for every single invoice that they pay, you can kind of see how the dollars start rolling in there very quickly. Then there will be other fees that'll be tacked on. And honestly, this can be across the board. So really the best question you can ask is, what other fees can I expect other than commission and maintenance? And this is just my PSA. I don't think you will ever find a property management company that will include hourly maintenance as part of the commission and have that commission rate make logical sense. If you are getting all-inclusive maintenance in there, chances are you are paying for a hell of a lot on that commission rate. So there's my PSA. Most places, and in fact, I think it's best if maintenance is charged separately. Of course, figure out what those fees are going to be, ask about those, and ask that $1 million question of what other fees are possible. Don't use the word expect, because then they're going to be the most common ones. Ask what other fees are possible, and make sure you put that word possible in there. All right, so we've covered fees. What's the next big thing you want to talk about? The next big thing I want you to get an impression of from the property manager is how they operate in two key areas. Number one is delinquency, and number two is maintenance. So we'll start with delinquency first. You want to get an understanding of how serious they take delinquency. What is their policy? If they don't have a policy in place, if they don't react to policy and start talking about how on the fifth day that there's a late fee, and then on the fourth day after that, they're issuing late notices or whatever the official day notices in your state. In Wisconsin, it's 5 days. If they're not spieling off what they do, boom, 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 to get your rent collected when you ask that question, they probably don't have a clear direction on how they do it, which means I'm going to question if they're actually effective at rent collection. So when you ask about delinquency, you should be finding out what exactly their policy and procedure is. Get an idea of how they operate on it, and ask questions about when was the last time they had to do an eviction. Now, of course, evictions right now, they're not as common, but yet I will say for us, before COVID happened, we hadn't had an eviction in over 3 years. COVID happened. We actually did get an eviction to go through monetarily, despite the CDC moratorium. And that was our first eviction that we had in 3 years. And this person just had to get out. They had a lot of money that was owed to them, or that was owed to the owner. But generally speaking, right now, evictions, you can't really do them, but you definitely want to get an idea of how much they really do have a problem collecting rent, and in a normal circumstance, how much of that goes to eviction. I actually am very proud of the fact that we don't have a lot of evictions. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't people that owe a little bit of money, but we're being very proactive. And you want a property manager who's going to be proactive. You don't want a property manager who's going to sit there and say, okay, well, we didn't get September, but maybe we'll get September and October, and we'll get half of October in October. You want someone who's going to really be gung-ho and sort of a pit bull at getting your rent collected. And that's why you want to ask what their policy and procedure is. Make sure they're not wishy-washy. Make sure they're stating it like it's it's the Lord's Prayer. It's something they got memorized and they can just say it right out loud right away. Then you want to cover maintenance. One of the biggest reasons that tenants move is when maintenance is not handled properly. So if they are slow to respond to maintenance, if they don't fix things properly, those are all reasons that tenants very quickly move. So that's some stuff you want to get an idea of ahead of time. So you want to find out, what is their procedure for when a work order comes in? How long does it take them to respond and make first entry? So there's response, which is like acknowledging the work order, scheduling it. But then first entry is when they actually get in, address it, and then how long it takes to get their work orders resolved. So what is the average lifespan of a work order in that property management company? Now, of course, some things can play into it, that maybe they had to bring in an outside contractor, and maybe their procedure or work order isn't closed out until everything is done. Understandable. But you want to get a general idea of how long their average work orders stay open unaddressed. The other thing you want to find out, and this is a really good question to ask, is the ratio of maintenance personnel to units. Generally speaking, I tend to be on the ball of about 2 maintenance technicians per 130 units. You get less than that, it's really kind of hard to consistently have 2 people. But if you get someone who has, let's say, 300 units and they only have 2 maintenance techs, I would begin to question how effective they're going to be at responding quickly to work orders and how effective they're going to be at getting your turnovers completed. So generally speaking, I go for 2 techs for every 130 units. The other thing you want to find out is what they can handle in-house versus what they actually use contractors for. So there's going to be certain things that they'll always do in-house. Then there will be probably a list of some things that they will go outside for. So they'll go to outside contractors for these. Most common, it's going to be HVAC, especially when you're getting into central air, furnaces, those sorts of things. It's going to be very likely that they're going to hire an outside contractor. When you get to specialized plumbing, when you get to things like maybe old plumbing in some homes, or you get to a lot of copper or things that need soldering, that's also likely going to be something that'll be outsourced, just because those are very specialty things. It's also common to have carpet installation outsourced, and it's also fairly common to have painting outsourced, oddly enough. Usually, and this is something I've learned as I've expanded and networked with more property managers, is that it's not very common for the painting to be done in-house. And the reason for that is because that work is rather sporadic, but when it does happen, it takes up a lot of time on the maintenance tech's parts. So it is, I'd say, fairly common for painting to be outsourced to another company as well. And I said there were like 2 things in maintenance, but I'm going to toss in a third here. So the third is you want to find out how they respond to emergencies. What is their emergency procedure? Is there a dedicated emergency line that is called? Is it a 24-hour answering service? And what is exactly the procedure? So what is considered an emergency? How long do they have to respond to a maintenance call before maybe the next person in the phone tree is called? These are all important questions to find out because, again, maintenance is one of the biggest reasons why tenants move. It's maintenance not being handled effectively. And that happens with work orders, and it also happens with emergencies. So definitely get an idea of their emergency procedures, what they consider an emergency, what their actual sort of like the step-by-step process is for emergencies, and get an understanding on that. That's really sort of the biggest areas I always encourage everyone to cover. But then there's these little smaller ones that I think if this is important to you, you should discuss it. So one of the things that you should discuss if it's important to you is how exactly your surplus funds are paid out. So most property management companies, they operate using a trust account, which means that we're going to collect your rent, we're going to deposit it into our trust account. Then at the end of the month, we're going to do what's called end of month accounting. And I shouldn't say at the end of the month. After the month has ended in the first part of the following month, we're going to do our end of month accounting. In that accounting, we're going to charge you for commission. We're going to charge you for the other fees. We're going to charge you any last minute maintenance that hasn't been charged out yet. We're going to charge all these stuff and get everything dispersed out for funds. What's left over, the surplus, may be eligible for distribution to you. Now, there's always going to be a reserve that you're going to have in a trust account, and that reserve will be negotiated per your contract based on the size of your units and sort of maybe what might be an anticipated threshold of expenses. But generally speaking, then you have the surplus that can be paid out to the property owner. Most property management companies nowadays can pay their owners via EFT. So you can get your money within a day or two. Maybe your property management company doesn't quite have that. Maybe they still do snail mail check. This is something you're going to want to find out if maybe you have to plan ahead and have extra reserves in your account for things like insurance that comes out all the time or mortgage. So if that's a consideration for you, be sure and have that discussion up front and figuring out when funds are dispersed, how they're dispersed, things like that. The other thing I encourage you to discuss with the property manager is just take a few moments to gauge their knowledge of state law, especially if you don't invest in that state or you're not going to be actively looking over the property all the time. I think it's really important that you hire a property management company who truly knows your state laws. And again, one thing I have been despicably disturbed by is how many property managers label themselves as property managers but don't actually know their state laws. So I encourage you to take a few moments to kind of Google what the official laws are in your state. And this is going to be dry reading because I want you to get it from the source. I want you to Google South Dakota rental statutes or Montana rental statutes and take a few moments just to look over those. Figure out what day of notice is required, 3-day, 4-day, 5-day. Figure out what the rules are on security deposit and just kind of quiz your property manager because, again, this is like a job interview. If you're hiring someone to work for you, you want to make sure that they have those skills to do the job. Well, in order to do the job as a property manager, you've got to know the state laws. So definitely take a few moments to gauge their knowledge on state law. This is going to save you a ton of headache because ultimately what happens is if something goes really, really wrong and there's a violation of state law, yeah, the property manager is going to get in trouble. But guess what? You're going to be on the hook as the property owner as well. So take a few moments, figure out a way to sort of gauge their understanding of state law and include that into your interview process with a property manager. That is a snapshot of hiring a property management company. There's a lot jam-packed in here. So I encourage you to listen a couple times and write stuff down. Just sort of start the thought process. What's important to you? How can you quiz your property manager? What sort of fees do you want to be sure and ask about? What's important to you as far as delinquency goes? Get a list of all this ahead of time and have a plan. I think it's great when a client calls me or I have a Zoom with them and they have a pencil and paper in front of them and they've got their questions all lined up. I think that's the most fantastic thing in the world. And that tells me you are a prepared and organized person, which means, hey, chances are I want you as a client. If you guys have any questions on this, please feel free to hit me up over on Instagram at LandlordChick. If you have any more episode suggestions, please let me know. Next week, we're going to dive back into private money lending, and we're going to get to the specifics of after you found somebody to lend you money. What are the next steps? So we're going to talk about mortgage agreements. We're going to talk about amortization. We're going to talk about payoffs. We're going to get into all that nitty-gritty on the next episode. Have a great week. I will talk to you next time.